Good morning. Well, we're well ahead of schedule. How often do you get to say that? That's pretty good, right? So what we're going to do right now is we're going to sing the canticle again. We're going to start with this side of the room with the first stanza, and then we're going to come in on this side of the room, okay? I'm only kidding. Okay. So it's my privilege this morning to introduce Sister Mary Rowell to you. She is a sister, I want to get this right. She is a member of the Congregation of the Sisters of St. Joseph in Canada. She teaches moral theology, Catholic social teaching, and eco-theology at the University of Toronto. Sister Mary is also vocation and first formation director for her congregation and serves as president of the National Association of Vocation and Formation Directors in Canada. She is also engaged in ecological and retreat ministry at her congregation's Ecology and Spirituality Center in Cobourg, Ontario. It's called Villa St. Joseph. Before entering the community, she was a nurse and a nurse educator in the United Kingdom. Sister Mary has a bachelor's degree in philosophy, a master's in medical law and ethics from the University of London, and a doctorate in theology from the University of Durham. Please welcome Sister Mary.
Well, good morning. And of course, none of that really matters because I failed. I don't have any pictures of myself in a hat or a uniform or moving characters. I did think about singing the Beatles song, Do You Want to Know a Secret? Sarah, I wouldn't trust my singing up here. It would tell you a little bit about me, like my age. However, there's method in my madness with that song because it is precisely about a secret, a big secret that I want to talk about this morning. Now, some of you will know a lot of this material very well. Others, it will be new to you. For me, it's always an immense joy to be able to speak about Catholic social teaching because it's so fundamental to who we say we are, and yet it has been an enormous secret. It's called the Church's best-kept secret, in fact. And why is that? Because it doesn't get well communicated. So this is the ideal setting for speaking about some of those fundamentals of Catholic social teaching. Now, I'm no communicator either, as any members of my community would say when I'm sitting in my office calling next door to the young sister who lives next door in the office next door, Christine, come and help me here. However, my only claim to communications fame is that I often post on our Facebook. Is that good enough, do you think? Yeah, okay. All right. And so why this particular topic? Well, I think that it serves, as Sister Teresa was saying yesterday, it serves to provide content. And as Father Larry spoke about the importance of content, it serves to provide very, very important content. It's lively, vital content at this present time for those of you who are communicators. It is something that can engage people and give those stories of hope and joy and transformation that Sister Teresa spoke about. So it is the best-kept secret. Well, I was thinking about talking about this with communicators, and I found this rather helpful quote, which I think is useful. A writer, and I've bracketed that as communicator, should have this little voice inside of you saying, tell the truth, reveal a few secrets here. And so that's what I'm asking you to do in your work. Reveal a few secrets. It's important for a variety of reasons that I'll mention as I go through this presentation this morning. And I think it fits well with those guidelines for strong communication that you would all be more familiar with than I from your professional practices. that in your case, you say that you are you're providing leadership in advancing mission, education, information, professionalism, and promotion of understanding. When we go through this presentation, we'll look at the numerous ways that women religious have participated in really enfleshing this Catholic social teaching. It helps in strong communication to untangle the knots that you see here. Untangle some of these knots of Catholic social teaching so that we can make the complex very simple. Tell the truth, and in this case, it is an amazing, joyful, revolutionary truth. It's ever ancient and ever new. In communication, we promote trust to make things possible. Now, I'm going to suggest in just one moment that at this time in our church, there is nothing more important that we need to do to trust, to promote trust that will now make things possible, instead of getting stuck in the deep hole, evil though it is, in which we find ourselves. It's about listening. In the words of the Second Vatican Council, it's reading the signs of the times. And you'll see as I go through how Catholic social teaching is always shaped by the signs of a particular time. And it always moves forward in those signs of this time. And so to understand the importance of timing in communication, I don't need to tell you, is vital. It's that timeliness. When do we publish something? When do we put something on Facebook? When do we produce a journal? Whatever we're doing, when do we communicate via video? All of those beautiful practical things you've been talking about. What about the timing? And Catholic social teaching matches that. It understands the importance of timing and also the context in which we are doing what we are doing. So timing and context then are so vitally important, both in communications and in living and revising Catholic social teaching. I don't need to stand here and tell you that today we have very, very clear problems. How do you communicate at this time when most of the general press is full of the sex abuse crisis? How do you communicate a balance? How do you communicate those elements of being church in the world and with the world that are so vital for people to know? How do we recognize the problems we are in and the evil that has generated them, but at the same time, how do you tell those stories of hope, joy, transformation still? Not easy, right? At this particular time. I don't know whether any of you has been challenged recently. I have from a variety of perspectives. In my role of leading the Canadian Vocation Formation Group, we've already had challenges. You know, why would you bring anyone into religious life? How are you forming them, given this context? So I don't want to get stuck on this point, but I think that it's important for each of you to listen and say, okay, so how do we tell the good stories that balance this out? And while acknowledging what has happened and may continue to happen, also tell the stories of the church alive in the world. How do you tell the stories of those, as Father Larry said at Mass this morning, religious communities that have always been on the periphery to some extent, that have always moved us forwards to transformation? You play an enormously important role in telling those stories, and particularly at this time, I think. So it's about integrity, and it's about balancing the stories. It's about telling the positive, and gifting context of the past and today. By that I mean that Catholic social teaching has great elements in it of joy-filled, transitional stories, both in our past, if you're looking at a historical perspective at any point, and of course of today. It's still working today. Take, for example, I'll try and give some examples to sort of ground this so it's not kind of some sort of academic exercise on, what are the principles of Catholic social teaching. I met a sister who was in charge, I think she was a Mercy, I'm not certain, but she was in charge of Catholic charities in Mississippi after Hurricane Katrina had hit. And she spoke about the things that had addressed many people's problems in Louisiana, for example. And she also spoke about, but not only did Hurricane Katrina cause poverty, it revealed the poverty that already existed in those states. And I was fascinated to hear her telling this story. And of course, she spoke about national and international aid that was pulled into those states that were so badly affected by Katrina. And she said, but now, 18 months later, they've all disappeared. But the poverty and the suffering continue. And she said, the only thing that is left there is Catholic charities. And so the stories of the past and today somehow merge beautifully as we look at how this has been enfleshed in the communities of religious women. Every issue, aspect, and principle of Catholic social teaching arises, as we'll see, in a particular and timely context. It's always an evolving context. It's something that continues to grow and grow right up to the present day. The encyclical that was referred to during our prayer this morning, Pope Francis's Laudato Si, is one of the great encyclicals or papal letters of Catholic social teaching. It goes into the teaching of the Church. And it's always organic, it's always moving, it's always in transition, it's always addressing the signs of the times. And that provides for us both a challenge as communicators and a great invitation to really tell those stories. And I'll try and weave a few stories into this because of, as you know as well as I, or better than I, that narrative is so important in our communications. And what you're telling in Catholic social teaching is good news, really good news, and it's still going on. It's good news in the biblical sense of the word, of good news. If we look at the Old Testament, and you'll remember the Hebrew scriptures from the opening of the conference, I have come for the poor, etc., etc. Quoting the prophetic sort of books of the Old Testament. Quoting the great theme of the Old Testament, which is covenant, relationship with God, with people, and that has become with all of creation as well, as we'll see. Covenant or relationship. So it also matches up with some beautiful parts of Catholic theology too. Even Christian theology generally, when we stand in church, those of us who go to church and say the creed, what do we say? I believe in. Keep going. Okay, don't worry, you haven't got to say it all. Yeah, okay. However we say that, I believe in God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, Creator, Redeemer, and Spirit. Why are we saying that? Because the very God we say that we believe in is a God of relationship, a God of diversity, and a God of unity. So theologically as well, it matches those Hebrew scriptures of good news, that it's a covenant, it's a relationship, and we all know just how vital relationship is in our lives. And of course, it's also a message in the prophets of the Hebrew Scriptures of liberation. And we'll see how the church struggled with, condemned, and then grasped a theology of liberation too. So it's about relationship. It's about liberation. I have come to set the captives free. It's definitely about the good news of discipleship. We see it in the living, in the dying, and in the rising of Jesus Christ that we are recounted in the New Testament. The good news is very present in the past, present, and I hope future of consecrated life. Now, of course, you can guarantee the vocation director is always going to be the optimist here, right? Yeah, so always speaks about the optimism despite the loss, and yet our movement forward, our movement in those new partnerships with each of you, our movement in partnerships with others, and I hope our movement in consecrated life too. But it's embodied Catholic social teaching. Catholic social teaching is also, interestingly enough, very often considered a basic human response. So, for example, when the first great encyclical, which I'll be referring to in a moment, that pertained to workers was written in 1891, the New York Times celebrated it as this wonderful contribution of the Roman Catholic Church to humanity. When Pope Francis issued Laudato Si, Praise Be, on the Feast of St. Francis, by the way, when he issued that beautiful encyclical, the world at large said, this is what it is to be human now in our world, in this very present day. And so it often also grasps the human heart. It's not something that is just basically sectarian or anything like that. And it speaks to those great partnerships that we are attempting to build for a better world. So it's good news that you're telling when you communicate the essence of Catholic social teaching in the stories, the narratives that you communicate widely. So the issues then are always in a context, but the issues remain the same in some ways. They are issues of poverty and hunger. They continue to be issues of working conditions. And when I read about the 19th century work on workers in Catholic social teaching, I often stand back and think nothing has changed, that we still are faced with these issues. Initially, the issue of war, or a just war, or what constituted a just war, was part of Catholic social teaching, and we've seen it grow into a stand for peace. Yes, the Catholic Church always spoke about life issues such as abortion and euthanasia, but we'll see as we go through this presentation that they grew and grew like topsy, that we now have much wider considerations of life. Other issues that have been embraced and lived out in Catholic social teaching are issues of racism, sexism, and now issues of sexuality, orientation, etc. The criminal drug culture, more recently, has become involved in Catholic social teaching. Very significantly, contemporary slavery. That's trafficking, sex trafficking, work trafficking, the issue of capital punishment. And I don't know whether everyone in the room knows that Pope Francis has, building on the work of Popes Benedict and John Paul II, has, and I'll say a little more about this, has now finally and conclusively said that Catholic social teaching can never embrace the death penalty. No. I understand that could be a tricky topic in the United States, but and it's not for me to say what is right or wrong, but this has actually sort of come of age, if you like, through Catholic social teaching on life. And last but certainly not least, perhaps fundamentally, within recent years, the environment and what Pope Francis, and I'll speak to this later, calls integral ecology. So these marvelous issues that connect us truly to what's going on in the world around us. Women religious have always been involved in these sorts of issues. Yesterday, I have a feeling, I think, is the communicator for the Sisters of St. Joseph of Philadelphia here? Oh, that's right, you are, aren't you? Okay. I think that's the Philly Sisters in the past. And that continues today. And of course, I've got my vocation director's hat on here now. Today, those issues are still important. And these, by the way, are the Sisters of St. Joseph novices currently completing their canonical year in Rochester, New York. They have just those same concerns today. And I know Father Larry spoke to the issue of sort of more traditional practices that younger people like. This is true. But it's not just, as he said, traditional in every sense of the word. I would say that one of the most beautiful stories I heard was of a young woman that one of our Toronto sisters asked me to have a chat with when I was in the city. She was a young woman who had just completed her master's at the University of Toronto in international studies. And she wanted to go overseas to a poorer country to do some work for a time. She discerned that, but she hadn't quite discerned how she wanted or how she might go about that. So Sister Jackie said, well, I know someone who used to work in poorer countries, voila, and that maybe it would help to have a conversation with her. So I met this young woman, and I was profoundly impressed by her answer. I thought, well, so I'm going to have to introduce myself and get to know her a little before we have this conversation. So I said to her, so now tell me, what is it that motivates you to go and work in a poorer country? And she said, well, Mary, it's every time that I go to the Newman Center and for adoration and kneel in front of the Blessed Sacrament, and when I am in that presence of Christ meditating there, I realize that I must be the presence of Christ, the real presence in the world where it's suffering. There, I think, was a lovely story of the connect that some of us struggle to sort of understand a little bit. So whether it was yesterday in Philadelphia or today in Rochester, New York, I think we still see this great commitment to social concerns, however we root it. So then, what is Catholic social teaching? Well, as I've indicated, it's contained in social encyclicals, that is, letters of the popes, and general social teachings that also include the letters of the bishops. And I have to say, some of the work of the US bishops has been absolutely outstanding, and we'll see some examples of that. That's true. But the real story, I think, contains much more that is relevant for you. Now, if you go to a Catholic university and study the subject, or if you are in a Catholic seminary, what you get is the letters of the popes to start off. In 1891, Pope Leo XIII wrote an encyclical. That's how it starts. That wasn't the beginning at all. There's so much more to the story. And I think that, you know as communicators that you often have to dig to find those really beautiful nutshells of a story, those roots of a story, because it was initially a grassroots movement. And what actually happened was that the beginnings had a very human face. It was set in the context of the Industrial Revolution in the mid-1800s in Germany. And a lot of it began with one single priest called Father Wilhelm von Kettler. And he eventually, the following year, became the Bishop of Mainz in Germany. He was a very remarkable man who had a very brilliant mind. He had a very political mind. He was held up as being very knowledgeable on the German Constitution. But he was more than that. He had been a parish priest in one of the poorest parishes in Berlin. And he had seen, first and foremost, the struggle of the people as the Industrial Revolution. Remember, I said it's always in a context. He had seen what happened in that time. People couldn't afford to put a roof over their children's heads. They couldn't feed their children. Families were breaking down because of the tension. People were having to hold 2 and 3 jobs simply to give their children bread. Does this ring a bell, by the way? I don't think that much has changed. We still need to be engaged in these sorts of things. And he was tremendously worried about that. It worried his conscience as a priest, as a member of the church. And he said, the church isn't responding as we ought to, given the teaching of Jesus in the New Testament. He was eventually moved to Mainz. And he was invited to give some leadership in a first great meeting of Catholics in Germany. From that grew what came to be known as social Catholicism. In the Anglican, in the Episcopal Church here, it was called the social gospel. So we shared it with other Christians. Father von Kettler realized that people were in grave difficulty because of the working situations. He was asked to give 6 sermons, I beg your pardon, 6 sermons in Advent in the great cathedral in Mainz. And he stood before all of these crowds gathered piously for Advent, and instead of addressing a constitutional issue that the church was involved in at the time, he spoke. He told the stories of the poor people, the people who were vulnerable, the people who were so tired their family network was breaking up, the people who were so exhausted they were losing a sense of God because they couldn't go to church on Sunday, etc. He was tremendously worried about both their material and their spiritual poverty. And so he addressed his Advent sermons to that end. He said, we cannot be Catholics. We cannot claim to be Christians unless we are engaged totally, practically in all of this. And from that grew and grew like Topsy, a multitude of things that were to happen to set the scene for Catholic social teaching. A large group of people gathered in that cathedral began to gather in social groups, like those old European salons. They gathered. They didn't just gather with the aristocracy, they gathered with those workers who could tell their stories. So Catholic social teaching always has to ask the question, and who should be at the table? Think about it as communicators. Are we not asking those questions now, and who should be at our table as we are fewer in number, but still wish to engage in these beautiful works? Gradually it grew. It spread from Germany to France, where young people in their thousands became involved. And I was reading the magazine on the plane. I was reading the magazine that is issued by the Congregation of St. Joseph, the amalgamated Congregation of St. Joe's in the United States, where it said, of all people who need to hear this, it is the young. In France, in the 1800s, the young came together for these social discussions, and the beautiful thing about them was that they never ended with, and this is what Catholic social teaching teaches, they ended with, and what will we do before our next gathering? So it generated all of these practical these beautiful practical initiatives on the part of the young. From France, it spread to Austria, to Italy, and it literally grew and grew and grew. There was this groundswell of people who came to believe that they couldn't call themselves Catholic or Christian, or even human for that matter, unless we began to engage the suffering of the people and to actually do something practical about it. So social Catholicism was formed. It spread quite rapidly across the Atlantic with immigration patterns, particularly to places like New York, and in our case, Toronto, where there was great poverty amongst many of the immigrants. And this great movement grew, and I'll say something about the American church in a moment. The tenets of that belief were that charity is not enough. It's very, very easy, isn't it, for me to be like Lady Bountiful and give a handout to somebody sitting on the street. It is much harder to challenge the very systems that create the poverty in the first place. So it moved us from not to neglect charity, but to say that charity is never enough. It has to be a matter of justice too. It dealt in the early days with just wages and working conditions for those who were poor. And it advocated organic models of ownership, which actually sounds quite modern in some respects. It speaks to the partnerships we're already looking at today. It spoke to the great factories of that time that was simply using the people, but to give them shares, to give them part, to give them voice. So it spoke to very, very organic models of organization in employment. And the role of the American church was absolutely phenomenal, particularly in the person of Cardinal James Gibbons of Baltimore, who looked at all of these things that were happening. Now, keep in mind that Pope Leo XIII, who was sitting in Rome at the time, was a great admirer of Father von Kettler's writings and work, and had kept apace with what was going on in this great groundswell, this grassroots movement. And Cardinal James Gibbons had reason to be concerned because he thought that Pope Leo XIII was going to condemn the first union in the United States, the Knights of Labor. And he went to Rome for several reasons. And he said to the Pope, look, the people are telling us what it is to be Catholic, what it is to be Christian. Now, I ask you to formalize it in church teaching. And that wasn't until 1891. So from 1848 to 1891, this was an absolutely grassroots movement. I wish to God that we could tell our seminarians that, okay? Because it's not well taught in our seminaries. This was the laity and clergy working together. This was partnership at the very beginning. This was people like me and you. And we're still called. This is a great groundswell. We need to be engaged as they were engaged. We need to make a difference. At the end of Mass this morning, for those who weren't there, Father Larry said, go out and change the world. That was exactly what they were doing in phenomenal ways. They were going out to change the world, not to conform with Catholicism, but to change the world for people's, in this case, people's betterment. And Cardinal Gibbons was instrumental in asking Pope Leo to formalize it in 1891. Also, Cardinal Manning from Westminster in London, England, had stood with dock workers in their union protests about conditions of labor. He had gone out to the dockyards to stand with them, and he too asked Pope Leo, you must write this because the people have told us. Now, those of us who think that magisterium, church teaching, that great word, is top down, will find great relief in this because in fact this was one occasion, as far back as the late 19th century, when the people spoke first and the Pope followed suit. And so it's also a beautiful model, as today in the crisis we find ourselves in, we're being called to look at those structures. So a beautiful example. These make for wonderful stories for those of you who communicate. It's the stuff of effective communication. Not only is it the stuff of effective communication, I think, but you are very much the grassroots. You have so many beautiful tools as communicators to get these messages out there, to engage people, to change the world. So you have, I think, a very, very beautiful vocation to be able to communicate. It's a huge privilege to communicate the stories that can, in fact, change the world. And so the formalizing, as I indicated, began with Pope Leo XIII, who had followed all of this movement, and in 1891, he produced the first formal encyclical Rerum Novarum, and it was concerned with workers. It was concerned with the suffering of workers. The right that workers had to own property of their own. There's some complexities to that I won't go into at this point, but that they must have a living wage, that the role of the state is important in this, albeit it shouldn't be the dominant role. The role of the church, we can't stand back and look at these things, and the right to organize, that is, trade unions, etc. And gradually over time, of course, even though this was being written up formally, we had magnificent examples of the engagement of others. The first, of course, was one that you all know, the American Dorothy Day, who formed the great Catholic worker movement. Now, I don't know if any of you have been involved with Catholic worker. I know some of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Rochester, New York, have been. Wonderful organization that is still continuing. But I just wanted to make one remark for you. Yes, she did form houses for the poor on the streets of New York. She formed rural communities across the United States. But she started out with communications. She was a journalist. This is a great example, maybe your patron saint. I think she is about to be canonized, I believe. A woman of communications. It was the 1-cent newspaper, the Catholic Worker, that actually influenced thousands and thousands of people across the country to engage in these acts of social justice. She was also a great peace initiator, so she was thrown into jail quite a few times for her peace activities. Remarkable woman. If you've never read any biography about her or her autobiography, I recommend that you do so. And she was a journalist. She was a communicator. So that also suggests that you have this wonderfully privileged and gifted role in telling these positive stories. She was clear that the spiritual life couldn't be disconnected from social reform. And so she would say, for example, the Mass is the work. So she'd go to early morning Mass and then go and do her work with the poor. That's also interesting, because perhaps for you as communicators, write up stories of worship too. The way in which that engages social justice is beautiful. And particularly young people like to see that link made. She made the link. And of course, many other people also began, lay people, to begin to live out and enflesh this Catholic social teaching. It was widened somewhat by the work of the liberation theologians in Latin America. As you know, hard for them at first. There was condemnation of some of their work because it was associated with Marxism, etc., etc. But some of those great principles of liberation reminded us of the Hebrew scriptures where the people were liberated. And so we move from simple sort of work with the poor to systems of justice that liberate people to do it for themselves. And so that also had an immense impact. And we saw then this evolutionary character of Catholic social teaching. It moved, if we were to look at all the various documents, you'll see very significant movements. It moved from concerns about the conditions of work to the dignity of work. Not that it forgot the conditions of work, but it also began to speak of the dignity of work. Pope John Paul II was very strong on that. It's moved from conditions of human poverty and hunger to embrace issues of racism, particularly in countries, and I know in Toronto, we have just had a report. Now, Toronto hides it well. We don't see a great deal of obvious poverty in Toronto. And by and large, the living is good. But a report has just been published that demonstrates that we in Toronto, that the people who are still disadvantaged in Toronto are people of color. And Toronto, because it's such a cosmopolitan and inclusive city in many ways, we don't have the violent racism, at least that many of us experience across the world. But it's still there. So it moved from human poverty and hunger to issues of racism, and ultimately, and more now, with Pope Paul VI, who is about to be canonized, Pope Paul VI, to issues of globalization. What is it to really engage in human development? When we engage in human development, when we give money to poorer countries, etc., are we doing it for our own well-being, or are we truly doing it out of concern for the people? Do we only invest in those countries? Do we only give charity to those countries and address justice issues when it suits ourselves? He moved us away from that. He said, look, Catholic social teaching needs to embrace globalization, but it needs to do so in such a way that we are absolutely concerned with real human development. It moved, as I said earlier, from notions of just war to peace movements. And I would say that John Paul II almost moved us to pacifism. Not quite. He said there are still conditions for a just war. However, he doubted that given our modern weaponry, it could ever be fulfilled. We could ever meet those criteria, rather. And so he then began to move people into peace movements. The sisters, of which you are all a part, the sisters already had touched into this, along with the then Jesuit, he left the Jesuits, John Deere, working for peace. And we'll see some pictures of that in a moment. It moved from a limited concept of the sacredness of life, that is abortion and euthanasia, not that it changed those teachings, but to what has been called a consistent ethic of life. And that was to say, we can't talk with integrity about abortion if we're not also prepared to address women's poverty, women's status, if we are not prepared to address quality of life issues. The Archbishop of Boston, Humberto Honduras, in the mid-1950s, 60s, said, we can't talk about this unless we are talking about education, housing, food, and those sort of things. We can't talk about it unless we deal with issues of domestic violence. And I know the Sisters of St. Joseph of Boston are engaged in a project around domestic abuse amongst immigrant families. In other words, we have to have this consistent ethic of life so that a woman may feel less pushed, for example. And so Pat Kozak from the Congregation of St. Joseph wrote a very nice little article recently, and she put in it, what ifs? In other words, we can't simply talk about abortion, but what if there was housing, affordable housing? What if there was food? What if there was employment and education, et cetera, et cetera? The what ifs. That makes beautiful stories too. The what ifs. The what if we were to do this? How would we impact this sense of life more thoroughly? Now, there have been, again, some complexities about that, which the new Archbishop of Chicago is dealing with very, very helpfully. I never know how to pronounce his name. Does he pronounce the C? Cupich, not Kupich. Okay. Archbishop Cardinal Cupich he has called it now a consistent ethic of solidarity, to stand with the poor as a matter of life. Now, as I say, it has had a few complexities, but he is helpfully trying to move thinking in this country through that conundrum. So there's great consistent ethic of life. And where we saw that emerging, interestingly enough, was threefold, I would say. The peace activists, Eileen Egan, here in the United States, said that we can't possibly speak of abortion unless we speak of peace. The wonderful Cardinal Bernardine spoke of this consistent ethic of life. I believe he was the first to name it as such. And where he arrived at that was through his own transformation. He said he had worked on the United States Bishop's document on peace, which of course at the time was concerned with nuclear deterrence. And as he reflected on the potential of nuclear warfare, he said, wait a minute, it doesn't make sense for me to talk about abortion unless I'm also prepared to talk about peace. So here we see them sewing this beautiful garment together. Significantly, a person who greatly moved that forward was a young journalist called Margaret O'Brien Steinfels. Again, it speaks to how much you can do as communicators to really change the world. She was in her early 20s. She was a good Catholic girl. She'd been writing about abortion. And she was looking forward to a free morning where she could sit down and drink her coffee and read the New York Times. So she had the New York Times delivered, so she went to get her paper. She set it out on the table with her nice cup of coffee, thank you very much. And on the front page was a picture of the then Cardinal Archbishop of New York, Terence Cook, sitting in the cockpit of a fighter bomber that had just taken innocent lives in Vietnam. And she was shaken out of it. She said, wait a minute, how can we possibly consistently talk about abortion without also talking and combining these other issues? So it was a young journalist who was very instrumental because of her communications and her writings then that moved the church forward into this consistent ethic of life. And so we see it growing and growing. And out of all of this work, and out of the encyclicals too, arose those great key principles of Catholic social teaching. Some of you will be familiar, but as I say, it never ceases to excite me when I'm looking at what the really good stories are. First key principle always is human dignity. Why? Because humans are made in the image of God. It's an inherent dignity before any possible achievement whatsoever. It's not about what I've achieved or what I've done, but before any means of achievement. So of course it includes those who are cognitively disabled, etc., etc. It's an inherent dignity of the person. Respect for all persons. Respect for the rights of people. It embraces that sacredness of all life and that consistent ethic of life about which I've just spoken. So these great, great principles are the underpinnings, if you like, of all that you will see our communities and our partnerships having done and doing. That second great key principle, community and the common good. The person is not only sacred individually, but is also social. Why? Because they're made in this image of God, unity in diversity. It calls us to address issues of societal organization, to link economics, law, policy, etc. We're terribly fragmented people at the moment, aren't we? I used to work years ago in ophthalmology, so medicine was a good example. And I went to the ward, I was a staff nurse, I went to the ward one morning and the night nurse said to me, "Mary, I think Mr. Such and Such has had a heart attack." And so I went to look at this guy and I thought, yeah, he has. So he'd had his eye operated on the day before. So I called the resident and I said to him, "I think Mr. X," this was an eye hospital in London, you'll know, Moorfields Eye Hospital. And I said, I think, we need to transfer him to the general hospital. And the doctor said to me, "Well, is his eye quiet?" Which any of you who've been nurses or doctors will know means, is his eye okay? Is it red? Is it sore? And I said, "Well, his eye is fine, but the man's had a heart attack. But is his eye okay?" I was getting absolutely nowhere. I had to call the staff physician and call him in because this man could have died. But because we have subspecialized so much, only the eye mattered. In our education systems, it's the same, isn't it? We don't really connect. In our life, in our moral and spiritual living, we don't always connect all of these things. And so it's connecting economics, law, public policy, etc. It's promotion of the common good at a very practical level. And we're not too good at that these days, are we? It's making sure that everyone gets a piece of the pie. Because our society has become very much into individualism, right? And individual rights rather than what is good for the whole. And so this principle is still very prevalent. Where do you see the communities of which you're a part, for whom you work? Where do you see these promoting this notion of the common good? Because, and here I put my vocation director's hat on again, for the young people in an individualistic age, witness to community is absolutely essential. Canada has just done a CAR report, as you did in the United States, as they have done in Australia and France, to look at the religious vocation situation in the country, and discovered that the most important thing, one of the most important things that will attract a young person is witness to community. Why? Because they have a sense of the common good. They're a little bit tired of some of the individualism that my generation has advanced. Rights and responsibilities. Everyone, and by the way, you've got a handout on these, everyone has a fundamental right to life and to those things required for human decency. Corresponding duties and responsibilities to one another. It's not just about rights. How often do we hear in our society, well, it's my right. It doesn't matter if it tramples on all of your rights, it's my right. Corresponding duties and responsibilities to one another, to our families, to our local communities, and to the larger society, particularly in light of globalization. That very special principle of the option for the poor and the vulnerable. The question that we need to ask about our lives is, how are our most vulnerable members of society faring? Because we do see, don't we, deepening divisions between the rich and the poor. This principle says that the needs of the poor and vulnerable are to be considered as primary. they are local, and they are global responsibilities. Participation. All people have a right to participate in the economic, political, and cultural life of society. Now, again, I would say the American bishops have been great leaders in this. When they wrote their great document on the economy some years back, everyone said, why is it taking them so long? It was taking them so long because they brought the right people to the table to listen to them, the people themselves who didn't have a voice, the disenfranchised, the poor. And it's wrong for a person or a group to be excluded. And the US bishops said this, which I think is very helpful. The ultimate injustice is for a person or a group to be treated actively or abandoned passively as if they were non-members of the human race. Beautiful statement from the US bishops. The dignity and rights of workers has continued to be a concern of Catholic social teaching. The economy must serve the people and not the other way around. Basic rights of workers must be respected, the right to productive work. Think about this in our political situations right now. To decent and fair wages, the freedom to organize and join unions, a right to private property, and economic initiative. Now, as I say, I did a handout of these for you, so you don't have to sort of scribble all of these down. It's just to sort of lay the foundations. Care for creation. This is the very, very sort of new transition. It started very much with Pope Paul VI on to John Paul II, and Pope Benedict was actually quite amazing at doing this, and of course, now Francis with his great encyclical Laudato Si, praise be, speaks to the sacredness of all creation. We are called to protect both people and the planet. And I always like to quote this one because those who are concerned about what Pope Francis is doing, to put it mildly, are often people who say everything went to hell in a handbasket when John Paul II died. Now, I respect John Paul II immensely. I've got Polish blood, by the way. What else could I do? It was John Paul II who said, care for creation for Catholics, for Christians, is, and I quote, not an option. It is part and parcel of who we're meant to be. So it's not something new that Francis has suddenly drummed up out of a hat. And of course, what is new with Francis is this notion of integral ecology, about which I'll say something in a moment. Another great key principle of Catholic social teaching is solidarity with one another. We are our brothers and sisters' keepers. We are united as one human family, whatever our national, racial, ethnic, economic, and ideological differences. We are to stand with one another. And love of neighbor has global dimensions. I'm just thinking of your lovely song by Breath. Illustrates this great principle beautifully. The role of government, the state has a positive moral function. It should be an instrument to promote human dignity, protect human rights, and build the common good. It must assist citizens in fulfilling their responsibilities to others in society, and it must incorporate a principle of subsidiarity, where the people at the lowest possible level have a voice in what is occurring. So important politically, too. And the 10th great principle is promotion of peace, a positive, action-oriented concept. Peace is not just the absence of war. This is Paul VI. It involves mutual respect and confidence between peoples and nations. It entails collaboration and binding agreements. And being a Canadian, I won't talk about the North American Free Trade Agreement right at this moment. And it implies intrinsic relationship between peace and justice. As Pope Paul VI said, if you want peace, work for justice. So these great principles of Catholic social teaching then, they're beautiful foundations on which to draw out the narrative, the stories of the past, the present, and hope and joy for the future. If any of you hasn't seen the great documentary, The Sisters of Selma, I recommend that you all run home and watch it. It is a wonderful document. That, of course, is the same, one and the same sister. It was, and I'm just giving a few quick examples here of where religious congregations have and continue. You might recognize some of your friends coming up here, where they have and they continue to work for social justice, so racism. Great peace initiatives. To be in solidarity today with immigrants. Religious freedom in support of women. And the question of capital punishment. If you've seen the movie Dead Man Walking, you will know of Sister Helen Prejean. So here are sisters, here are communities engaged all the time, even now, in all of these great initiatives. Spread the stories, because this is good news, this is hope. Sister Helen Prejean, of course, you know, had a great cooperation from Pope John Paul II, and as I say, he has very, very recently condemned capital punishment entirely. But the great theme is drawing all of these together. And this has happened with Pope Francis. He says in this encyclical, it's not a matter of caring only for people, or that people take superior place over and above our work for the environment. And it's hard for people to grasp, isn't it? They say, oh, for goodness sake, Mary, why are you growing lettuces at that ecological center? You could be out on the street serving the poor, right? It's understandable. Here we have Pope Francis in the latest social encyclical saying, but everything is connected. Nature cannot be regarded as something separate from ourselves or as a mere setting in which we live, because we are part of nature. We're part of creation. We have a particular role, but we are part of nature. And therefore, he says, all of these things in Catholic social teaching need to be brought together. We must seek, he says, comprehensive solutions which consider the interactions within natural systems themselves and within social systems. The two have to come together. Now, that can sound a little bit highfalutin, so I want to tell you a quick story of what happened before I entered the community. I worked on prevention of blindness programs in poorer countries. And I was in Bangladesh, and I was sent with our community eye health specialist to a small rural school in a village, where other rural school teachers walked some 13 miles or so to hear a session on how to recognize vitamin A deficiency in children's eyes. There's an obvious sign, and it can be dealt with quite cheaply. Not that it is, but can be. So we were to give this talk. Afterwards, we were waiting for the rickety bus to take us back to the city. I was with Chad, our community eye health specialist out of New York. And we walked down beyond the school to a very, very murky river. And to my right, I heard a rustling. And I turned, and even though I'd worked in poor countries for a long time prior to that, I think I saw the greatest icon of human poverty that I've ever seen. It just struck me as an icon. You know, you're invited to walk into icons. It was a young woman, very emaciated, with a baby at the breast who probably wasn't getting any milk because of her nutritional status, an older woman who had looked as though she was starving, a young toddler with all the signs of chronic malnutrition. Their home was a piece of plastic over some twigs, outside of which was a cooking pot. And of course, there was nothing in the cooking pot. And I don't know what it was about that scene that riveted me. And I can tell you that I would not be a Sister of St. Joseph today had that woman not looked at me with the greatest dignity. She gave me life. She's probably dead. And I was riveted by that scene. When I got back to the city, I asked the ophthalmologist, the Bangladeshi ophthalmologist with whom I was working, I said to him, I read in our advance package that that used to be a fertile valley. He said it was, Mary. He said the problem was a multinational chemical company based out of North America decided they needed cheap labor. And so what they did was to bribe a local village leader to ask the people if they would give up their small parcels of land, and if they did, they were promised a North American lifestyle with work and money. So they did. And that was the reason that I was now in the school talking about children's vitamin A deficiency, from which thousands a year go blind or die. And so he said, but the point was, when the factory was built, very few people had the education to do the work that was needed, so they bussed people in from the city. He said, so the people now had no jobs and no land. And then he said, but they were okay, they fished the river. And then the chemical company, not bound by your laws in North America of health and safety, tipped toxic chemicals into the water, all the fish died, and now the people starve. That for me was, we cannot disconnect. We cannot disconnect environmental destruction and human poverty and suffering. Where there is one, there will be the other, and it will escalate in a circle. So that for me was a great education that helped me over this sort of hump of not quite understanding that why we would be called to look after both. One of the greatest stories, of course, is Sister Dorothy Stang, a school sister of Notre Dame de Namur, American sister who was in Brazil, who had worked for years for the rights in the rainforests of both the environment and the people whose land had been taken from them by the great landowners. She was a wonderful example of this integral ecology, of respecting human life and dignity and supporting the people, and of healing the environment. She eventually, after many years, got the legal rights to the land back to these poorer people living in the Amazon rainforest. The morning she was to take those documents to the people, she set out very early. She always carried a plastic bag, apparently. And she was stopped by two men with guns. And there was a man who was accompanying her, who she said, you go and do such and follow me, which is how we had a witness to it. And then these men with guns said to her, so sister, have you got any weapons in your bag? She knew one of them. She said, well, you know I haven't. She said, the only weapons that I have in my bag are the land claims of the people in the forest. And she said, and a Bible. And she took her Bible out and began to read the Beatitudes. And as she did so, they shot her to death. So she gave her life for this integral ecology. Wonderful stories of religious communities. Your own experiences. I would invite you to think about your own experiences of the congregations of which you're a part and for which you work. What are your own experiences? What are your own stories that illustrate this wonderful content of Catholic social teaching? Leave you to reflect on that, because I hope with your help that good news is continuing to come. It's good news that can be communicated for hope in our world. Good news about what your congregations are doing and what they're doing in partnership with others, those great partnerships. So I plead with you to reveal the Church's best-kept secret through your skills and your gifts in communication, through your commitment to truth, to listening, to communicating, because you are people who bear hope with and for us. You are hope. And hope, as Desmond Tutu said, is being able to see that there is a light despite all the darkness, here is hope today. You are hope, and I thank you for everything that you do. So, thank you. We have about 2 or 3 minutes if there are any questions or comments anyone wishes to make.
Catholic social teachings are the reason of what we do. So
Yes. Yeah.
just bookmarks. It's just as easy as a prayer card.
Yeah.
One example, when we were trying to talk about why we want peace, you have to acknowledge where your people are. So we acknowledged that at one parish, you had to have a prayer card, the prayer of St. Francis. That's how we, kept going about peace. At another parish, it was just simple. We had the peace symbol because they were accepting of the peace symbol. That was enough.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Lovely examples of something simple in terms of communication that can make, as I said at the beginning, that which is complex very simple, and for people to be able to grasp, so that in your communications you engage others to work with us too. Yeah, thank you. Any other comments or questions? Yes, right at the back. So.
Thank you for your presentation, Sister Mary. It was fantastic. I'm wondering if either you or folks in this room, kind of crowdsourcing, have strategies that we can make Catholic social teaching more at the heart of who we are as church. Because in your slide on the social gospel, otherwise we could just call it the gospel.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Like it isn't like a teaching that's added on
Exactly.
to what we do. I think we tend to treat it that way. Like we're so fixed with bishops and who's allowed to do what, but the mission, this is about mission. This is mission central for the church.
Yes.
So how do we make that kind of more the very rock, the very foundation of a church that's missionary in nature and not consumed with itself, but with what God is doing in the world based on the needs the world has for our witness?
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes, and I mean,
Okay.
I think there are no wonderful
There's
questions.
no quick answers, certainly, but
no quick
any
answers.
thoughts, ideas, suggestions?
I
would
have
be
a
great.
feeling, and this is maybe an awful thing to say, I have a feeling that because the church is in such a mess today, because of the negativity, as I've said, you have a very positive role in that, but I have a feeling that somewhere or other the Holy Spirit is circulating very strongly and inviting us to look at those structures that sometimes have kept it separate from the people. Now, I don't know about in the US, but in Canada we often have problems. Our bishops write the most wonderful documents on it, really good documents that are accessible. But I have never, unless I planted them in a church, ever heard a homily that included them. So one of the great challenges that I think we're faced with today by the Holy Spirit is to look at the way we understand our structures and communications within the institution. That's a bigger thing. And I do think this is an invitation, horrible though everything is and wrong though everything is. We are being invited now, I think, to move into a change in one of the greatest ways we've ever known. At individual levels, I think I know of a few examples that have been very helpful. I go back to Dorothy Day and her assertion that you can't separate spirituality and prayer from justice. How do we deal with that? Those of us who are responsible for preparing prayers, for contributing so beautifully to liturgies in music and in prayers of in prayers of petition during our masses. how do we do that in such a way that people who may be a little scared of it, the me, my God, and I types, see that it's all part and parcel, as you rightly say, all part and parcel of this thing. How do we incorporate it in prayer? I think that can be very helpful. Communication of that would be wonderful. Communication that helps people to develop prayers, that make us aware that our relationship with God is intimately related to our relationship with people and creation. I have a friend and colleague in Toronto who has a group at a parish church where each Sunday after Mass, they gather for some coffee and they have a brief discussion of the next Sunday's gospel and what it means in light of social initiatives. I think we can engage university students in the way they did in France. And I think the most important thing is to bridge the gap between our spirituality, which is kind of dichotomized on one side, and our practices. So those are just a few examples that I know of that have been helpful, one on the grander scale and a couple on practical scales. We, at our ecology program, we have, in fact today, the Feast of St. Francis, we always have a group of school children who come just to sort of get them used to the environment and those sort of things. So there are small initiatives, small steps, and that sometimes makes us feel we're alone. But in fact, there are many people, not just religious people, making those small steps. How do we partner with people in social justice, whoever they are? How do we find our common denominators and not set aside our distinctions, but set them aside where the common denominators can help us to move forward? So those are just a few vague thoughts on it. Thank you. Okay, and I think time is coffee time, I think. But I'm around if anyone wants to ask anything else. So.